Today we're going to be talking about regulations. Most people don't have any idea of what regulations are, but they're really important. We've been talking about the legislative and the executive branch in both your readings and the videos for this week, and regulations are a key piece related to both of those. As you know, Congress passes legislation in the legislative branch, and sometimes that legislation is broad and sometimes it's specific. In cases where it's very specific and outlines exactly what Congress wants to do, the role of regulations may not be as substantial. But in cases where Congress passes laws that are broad, general, or don't have all of the details fleshed out, it's left to regulations to fill in those details where Congress hasn't done so. All that power moves to the executive branch. The executive branch is responsible for implementing regulations. They write them and then enforce them once they become part of the Federal Register. Regulations are a way to provide a way to operationalize legislation. It gets into the very minute details of eligibility, of enforcement, how programs are going to operate, where they're going to operate, what criteria are going to be used to evaluate whether someone is eligible to receive grant funding. All of these things can be done through regulation. They affect everything from legislation around healthcare policy can be implemented through regulation and have different eligibility criteria. It can affect environmental policy. Some of the largest environmental policy we've seen in the last few years has been done through regulation. Congress didn't pass any laws. The executive branch is able to use regulations to make policy even when laws aren't passed. So they can flesh out existing laws, or they can make changes to existing regulations that at one time were based on a law that asked an executive agency or department to create regulations. They can edit those in the future to approach new problems or things that may not have been considered when the regulations were originally written. There's a lot of power in regulations. You may have seen news coverage about regulations, either that there's too many of them, that they cost too much, that they're doing big, important things. There's lots of different perspectives on different regulations, but you might not have seen a lot of context about how they came to be, why they came to be, or how you could potentially influence them. So we're going to talk through some of those steps now, and I'll start with a specific example. So under the Obama administration, a regulation was passed to update the regulations for overtime. So overtime was a standard that was set in law with some details around how that was to be executed and then further fleshed out in regulations. In 2014, the Obama administration wanted to increase the threshold for who would be eligible to receive overtime. Right now, it is a fairly low level. Salary around $23,000 is the threshold for you to automatically receive overtime. If you're below that threshold, you automatically receive it. If you're above that threshold, there's other considerations that are taken into account, like what kind of job you have and how much sort of power you have in your position to influence the work that you're doing. But the Obama administration wanted to say that that threshold was out of date. It hadn't kept up with inflation, and they wanted to adjust it. And so they used regulations to do that. Congress didn't pass a law. The executive branch used regulations to say that they were going to increase that threshold to about $47,000 and then tie it to inflation going forward. So hypothetically, they wouldn't need to come back and change these regulations again. To do this, the Department of Labor published regulations. And anytime regulations are going to be published, they have to start with a proposed rulemaking. And those proposed rulemakings are made public and allow the public to make comments on them. Most people that comment on regulations are interested parties. They might be advocates, lobbyists, industry, someone who's going to be affected and has the resources, the time, and the knowledge to know how to influence this process through the regulating process. But anyone can do it. There's a website online that I'll show you in a moment where members of the public can submit their feedback. You may have gotten emails asking you to comment on a rule with some sort of generic text that had been created for you to make it easy for you to submit a letter to ask for some sort of change in regulation, or to support a regulation or not to support a regulation. All of those comments have to be considered by the agency that's issuing these regulations. So once the proposed rulemaking period is ended, it's usually about 60 days, the agency takes back all of those comments and has to consider them. They actually respond to what people have said are their concerns about that regulation, and they have to provide justification for why those concerns either aren't valid or there's some reason they need to proceed over those concerns. And so all of that has to be taken into account for the final regulation. And that final regulation, once it becomes public and is part of the Federal Register, where we have an accounting of all of our regulations over time, then it has the force of law. Those are things that people are held to. For example, if this regulation had stayed in place, which it didn't, but if it had, if you were an employer and you didn't automatically give overtime to someone who was under this new threshold of $47,000, there are penalties that could affect you. So it has force, even though it wasn't a law passed by Congress. It was something done by the executive branch. I was mentioning that there's a place where you could go and provide feedback regulations. Anyone can do it, and you can really do it at any time when a regulation is under consideration. So regulations.gov is the government-run website where all proposed rulemakings are posted. You can go there, you can provide feedback on whether this is a good idea, whether it's a bad idea, provide information about people who will be affected, data you have if you're working in the field around how many people are going to be affected, in what ways, how much this might cost. All of these things go into public comments for regulations and are then considered by the agency. So it's a good way to make your voice heard or to represent individuals that may be negatively or positively affected by a regulation. Once all of this happens and it is a final regulation, it goes into what I've referred to multiple times is the Federal Register. And you can look at these online. They're available in multiple places. I often use the website for Cornell Law School. They keep all of the regulations, and there's multiple parts. So you'll see the first section, 42, for example, here is referring to the public health chapter of the Federal Register, and that's where all regulations related to public health live. Then you'll see that there's a section number for the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services in the Department of Health and Human Services. So all of the regulations that have to do with HHS and CMS are in section 4 of Chapter 42, or Title 42, Chapter. All of the regulations that have to do with CMS and HHS can be found in Title 42, Chapter 4 of the Federal Register. And so you can go into the Federal Register and find whatever type of information you're looking for and regulations that apply for it, whether it's healthcare, labor, the environment, whether it's judiciary and criminal justice related. All of the rules that the executive branch has set, building off the laws that Congress passed, live in the Federal Register, and you can look there for policy decisions that have been made over time. So it should be clear to you by now that regulations are really important. Understanding how they work and how you can influence them is critical to being a good policy analyst, whether you're going to be working in government and potentially developing regulations, or working outside of government and wanting to influence regulations for the ways that they'll affect the population you're working with. Regulations are key, and I hope now you have a better understanding than most people do about how these work and why they're so important.